I was trying to think, while listening to the first two speakers, kind of how to position my talk. It is slightly different. I think the thing that's the really common theme is about the relationship between community initiatives and the state. A couple of points of interaction with the state come out quite strongly in this presentation, but not as strongly as in some other ones I've done on the same topic earlier. The second, perhaps less common point is that I'm focusing exclusively on empty homes, bringing empty homes into use. And the third one is that I'm focusing exclusively on that strange country across the Severn Bridge. So all of my examples are from England, which is a really weird place in terms of the context for community-led initiatives. This is a deliberately grey photograph to give a picture of the grimness, really, of empty homes and the injustice of empty homes. There are about 600,000 empty homes in England. About 200,000 of them have been empty for more than 2 years, so the long-term empty definition. And this is happening amidst a growing housing crisis in terms of scarcity, austerity, and I think we can see areas like Gresham and Middlesbrough as examples of both market failure and state failure. Because about 10 years ago, under the previous government, or government before last now, there was an attempt to do something about low-demand housing, and it actually resulted in there being more empty housing in places like Gresham for longer. And the property values and the impact on the people who were hanging in on there was really pretty disastrous. That was state. Here's perhaps much more typical things that you might see in villages, mining villages and areas in Wales. Abandonment of relatively small mining communities. This is 17 houses, half of them empty, one burnt out, 3 empty for over 5 years in a small village in County Durham. And then we go into another area that was affected by the housing market renewal pathfinder of the Labour government. This is in Hull, in West Hull, and you can see how empty homes, the problem of empty homes, is a magnet really for a whole range of other issues, so with antisocial behaviour being very evident in this photograph. But the injustice and the problem of empty homes is as big it's different, but it's still there in hot housing markets. So this is a lovely property in Forest Hill in South London. You can see it's very fragile. It's just being held up before the community-led group got hold of it. Housing associations have been asked to see what they could do to bring this property into use. None of their financial models stacked up. But amazingly, social enterprise called Phases, who got some funding from Big Issue Invest, was able to, and worked with ex-offenders, was actually able to bring this property into use as 2 very large flats, which are now leased to the local authority for people in housing need. The guy who owned this and had been quite happy for it to be empty for 20 years also had some empty flats above shops nearby. He had a shop and a cafe. And I went into one of those properties and found the news under a pile of dust, the News of the World from 1976. But as a result of what has happened on this property, he's quite happy now to bring those further properties above flats into use with the same social enterprise Phases. Of course, there's nothing new about this, and we've talked a bit about the 70s and 80s already. Very celebrated example on the left-hand side of Bonnington Square near Vauxhall in central London. This was a brilliant historic set of properties that had been acquired by the Inner London Education Authority because they were going to build a new school. They didn't build a new school, the properties were empty for some time, and we had squatting, and we then had regularised squatting, and a group of 11 households had formed a co-op, and it was an ownership co-op, and it lasted for 18 years. I mean, actually what's happened more recently, interestingly, most of the same people are still living there, but they decided to move away from that co-op model, and they've gone into individual homeowners. And it was quite interesting because they're saying, well, how much would it cost to live in a place like this now? Absolutely no idea, no one's ever sold. So it's really interesting in terms of I suppose some of the stuff we're hearing from Keith about the sort of think about the meanings and the way in which people see objectively the same space. Then similar example on the North Circular Road in London. This again, the late 1970s, it was blighted by a proposed road widening scheme, which didn't happen for over 30 years. And so a short life co-op called Riverlink was able to provide actually quite a long life housing for people. And it is really interesting, some of the advantages in terms of the low rents that we're able to charge in return for the contribution that people made to running the co-op and the maintenance of the properties. Sadly, during the period of our research, the Olympic Games came along to London and was a major regeneration project for this area. Large housing association, which itself had been community-led in the 1970s, got the funding and evicted Riverlink within an 18-month period, so that they couldn't actually retain the funding to move on to their next set of properties. I don't think Riverlink is actually operating now. So the solution that I'm talking about today is really community level action. This is a project in in Stockton-on-Tees that's been around for 25 years or so, called Community Campus 87. So you do the maths, 1987 it was set up. And they're really presenting a very strong solution. So the model is local action, people bringing empty properties back into use, either for community benefit or for member benefit. So some of them are member co-ops, but many of them are more sort of community benefit kind of organisations. A lot of them taking a social enterprise model, and a lot of them particularly interested in the employment and training activity on the properties rather than the living in the property side. The idea of meanwhile use has never really taken off in housing. It's really taken off in commercial spaces, but that's essentially what one part of this self-help housing model is about. It's having leases as long as you can on the properties to bring them in and continue them in social use. But the more attractive model for the organisations, which a number of them have been able to do, the further north you go, the easier it's been. Asset-based development, actually acquiring the empty properties as assets, borrowing against them, and obviously having a sustainable business from the rental income. So here's another one in Leeds. They've been around for 25 years, Latch Housing Co-op in Leeds. So what do you need? I mean, this is the kind of research by numbers in the first stage of my work. Well, what was it that explained the success of some of these projects and the difficulties that others had? And there were really 5 things that they all needed. So they needed to get the properties. And you think, well, 200,000 empty properties, that's not going to be a great difficulty. But actually negotiating access, identifying the owners, and coming to an agreement about either the terms of the lease or the terms of the sale is an enormous problem. So in most cases, they were only able to do that through partners, and of these 5 factors, actually, partners seem to be the best explanation of why some of the groups were succeeding and others weren't. Sorry, the photo, I'm doing slightly better with the photos because it's got a bit cloudier, but you see that one of the partners here has got a chain of office around his neck, so I guess that means he's got something to do with local government, and local authorities were actually really important partners for many of these organisations. Most local authorities have an empty properties officer. They've got a range of things that they can do to try and persuade the owners of empty properties to bring them into use on the sort of coercive side, but actually having some more positive carrot side. Well, you could actually connect with this community organisation, you could get an income, you could get your property connected, and you protected, and you can get it back at the end of a period. It was quite an attractive deal for many owners. Money. All organisations need money. The main problem that the self-help housing organisations were having really was with the initial repair costs of the property. Once the repairs had been completed, it was relatively easy to get a sustainable model of rent income, maintenance, and continued occupancy. But the key to the community within self-help housing would be the residents, people who were prepared to live in the properties, wanted to live in the properties, and in some cases were actually forming communities, and the workforce, the people who are actually doing the work on the property. Lots of links with colleges and accredited qualification. Here's another one that's been around in Hull for 25 years, late 1980s. They called themselves Gyroscope because they pooled their gyros to set up the organisation and get the first properties. But now you could actually see them as a fairly substantial SME. They brought 48 properties into use, and they've got lots of employment opportunities, lots of volunteering, and in a sense, the relationship between people running the organisation and the users and the members is actually rather different than it was at the setup. But still, I would say, part of the community-led sector. So what we found increasingly was, yes, these were housing projects. They were about tackling empty homes. They were about bringing those homes into use to meet housing needs, but a whole heap of other things that they achieved at the same time. In some cases, the groups were successful at getting paid for those other benefits. In many cases, they weren't. So they've actually got a bit hooked on this whole thing that's going on around social enterprise and social investment, of demonstrating what are the social returns that you're getting. So look at what one very relatively small organisation, Canopy, commissioned a social return on investment analysis to show that how many pounds worth of social value they were getting back for every pound of housing activity. Another distinctive thing I think about the sector over recent years is the peer learning dimension. So here's Steve from Canopy in Leeds, down in Birmingham, talking to new groups who were just starting to do work on empty homes in 2012. Behind all of this, umbrella organisation, as there often is in different parts of the sector, this one is called selfhelphousing.org. It's a website, as you can see, and lots of really useful information for groups who want to do this kind of thing, but it's also one man. There is only one person who works for selfhelphousing.org, John Fitzmaurice, and he's here talking not to new groups, but to funders at a meeting organised by Big Society Capital in 2015. So where does it come from? Comes from lots of different places, local initiatives, clustering and sharing, bit of a distant memory now, but the squatting movement of the 1970s and 80s was important in the formation of a number of groups, and some of those have actually survived, and it tends to be there are a number of co-ops in London that actually have their origins in this area. There's a really impressive story of there's an organisation called Tamil Housing Association. People came across in the emergency period in Sri Lanka, got into short life housing as the only way to get housing in London for their members, and actually are now a really successful registered housing association, doing all the kinds of things that housing associations do. But the problem was really about 50 organisations and not a lot happening. So the problem that they had was they had all the solutions, but they needed to link it to the policy and to an identification of the problem. So I've gone back to those kind of garbage can policy models, policy streams, to try and explain, why did things suddenly change in 2010? Well, there was a big problem in 2010. You could say the big problem is still around, but he had the idea of the big society. Well, he was promulgating the idea of the big society as a way of part of this kind of reducing the role of the state, but it had great difficulties both with big society and localism in pointing to examples on the ground of where and how this was happening. So the empty home sector, self-help housing sector, the other problem, of course, was that anybody know who this is? Grant Shapps, so later went on to be the Conservative Party chairman, but he was the first housing spokesman minister after the election. Anybody know, probably less likely to know who this is? Andrew Stanell, who's now in the House of Lords. He was the Liberal Democrat lead on housing. And I think you can say this is one of the areas where the Liberal Democrats did have some impact during the coalition, because they got a fairly substantial empty homes programme. And within it, and as a result of what went on in this arena, I'm trying to collapse a lot of stuff. And basically it was a 48-hour workshop in a conference centre at Windsor Castle, which brought together the self-help housing organisations, a number of the civil servants who were going to be writing the policies for this lot, and thinking about what on earth can we say about the big society and localism. And so the result eventually was £50 million for Empty Homes Community Grants Programme. So this is part of a bigger Empty Homes programme, but it was specifically for community-led organisations who were not housing associations, not registered housing associations. And I think it's different, but I think the recent 60 million community-led Southwest seaside areas funding, which has been announced this year, has probably certainly slightly similar origins. So what I'm going to try and do is to say a little bit about what's happened as a result of having this funding. I do think it's a fundamentally different way of procuring housing to the standard models that are developed. We've got 110 organisations, about half of whom hadn't been involved in housing development work before, who secured funding within this £50 million programme. And there are now self-help empty homes projects in every part of the country, but obviously on a different scale, a lot more the further north you go, for some reasons I'll try and explain. So why was the grant important? It really solved this problem of the gap on acquiring, getting use of the property and actually bringing it up to a habitable standard. So generally we're talking about £25,000 to actually do the works on the properties to bring them up to standard. Two models in terms of acquiring them. One is a long lease, and the aim is to get the lease for as long as possible, but it's generally been between 10 and 20 years. And then purchase and repair, you can actually use the grant to help to contribute to the purchase cost of the property. And generally people have been using the equity of having the property to borrow the rest of the money to do the works, etc. So it's made an enormous difference, and it's enabled organisations who were not able to get into this field before to get in. And we've got about, they count bedrooms, because it's actually thinking about what the savings are. Bedrooms brought into use 4,000 in about just under 2,000 properties over the period of the programme. So some of the interesting things about it is that it has got a lot of new groups into housing. So in the West Midlands, there was only one actually on the Self-Help Housing Organisation website in 2009. But over 20% of the organisations that got the grant were actually in my bit of the world around, sorry, this is Birmingham down here, and going up to the East Midlands and across to Shropshire and up to Stoke. So who were these groups? Quite a motley bunch, but organisations that were some way interested in the housing supply, organisations doing housing advice work and that kind of stuff. People are interested in the employment and training prospects, and the best I heard on this was we used to have our apprentices building walls and then knocking them down at the end of the class, and then we realised actually there were houses and you could actually do something on a house with the training activity. Social enterprises interested, then a few organisations, I think, I don't know where you'd position organisations like Emmaus in relation to intentional communities, but essentially it's a group of volunteers and service users who want to live together, and they contributed to the building works and to forming a basis. So this is a small one in Coventry, 4 flats in the original building into a staff flat and communal accommodation. And the importance of actually doing the project together comes through really strongly from this quote, if you can read it. Achieving something spectacular together. Now this one is interesting because it is actually a small housing association that focuses on young people. So how do they get the money? Well, they don't actually have many properties in management, so they qualified for the grant. But the really dramatic thing about this is this looks like a relatively recent constructed block of staff housing for health authority staff. So it used to be nurses' accommodation. It had been empty for 7 years, because the health authority had sort of moved out, so we're basically a provider of healthcare services. We're not a landlord, and so we won't do anything with that property across the road. And there are 4 like this, which have been empty for 7 years. And as part of this Live Work scheme, St Basil's has been able to use the grant and some private borrowing to bring the property into use and to actually offer 2-year apprenticeships for young people, formerly homeless young people, with the health authority, without having to have housing benefit for their rent. So the rent and the payment for the apprenticeship are linked together. So you're actually keeping people off of benefits. And here's another unlikely organisation that's now a proud landlord of a couple of properties in Redcar. Something in Mind is a local branch of the Mind charity. That's their charity shop. They were finding a lot of their clients with mental health issues were finding it extremely difficult to get private rented accommodation that didn't make their health worse. So actually having access to their own accommodation was really important, and the whole thing fitted together extremely well for them. having these properties on the balance sheet. So I'm not going to have time to go through the 6 key benefits, but we've kind of produced this evidence of how it was so wonderful what had been achieved as a result of the programme. So I've got one slide in each one. They were very good at handling the money, and they were able to, so they got the £50,000 from the government, but they were able to borrow at least 26,500 or get loans and grants from other sources. So one example here, quite a big organisation called Changing Lives in Newcastle, which used to be Newcastle Cyrenians, specialist homelessness organisation. They got £1.3 million, but they were able to turn it through the 3.8, etc., into 125 homes and employment and training opportunities there. One of the great benefits that the organisations were able to provide in many cases was local knowledge. So in this small suburb of Huddersfield, they were able to bring 29 of these wonderful Yorkshire stone houses back into use that had actually been empty in that community. This was the best one of the lot, and they actually needed the grant to do this one. It used to have a couple of pigeons and a cannabis factory, but not a lot else. And now it's a home for young people in the area, and then the employment, local jobs, etc. going on there. Very quickly, the approach to the training, workforce development. This is a guy who'd worked for a big construction company and a large housing association, and he saw the approach in this smaller kind of community-based operation as being completely different. It's actually a bit worrying for the funders. It was less important to hit the targets than to deal with the guys on the sites. Along a similar strand, a lot of these organisations do still have a voluntary participation element. In Canopy and Leeds, everyone who gets to move into the properties has to have worked on the properties. Slightly different approach in Fresh Horizons, volunteering to do garden clearance and that kind of stuff, and thinking about rewards around driving lessons in that case. So we've got real solutions to wicked problems. Here's the same street. It looks just as bad, but this is afterwards in County Durham, and they couldn't have done this without the grant. And what we've seen emerging from this phase, so we have these organisations, some of them have been around for 25 years or so, Canopy being one of them, it actually transformed their financial position and their sustainability. So increased their staffing, increased their assets. So they've now got 13 properties on the balance sheet. And this means in terms of sustainability for going forward, they're in a completely different position. So just finally, that was wonderful, but the money ended in 2015. So people would say this is an absolute classic kind of state initiative, put some money in, get some activity going, and then the whole thing falls down again at the end. So what our current research is looking at is how, what are the prospects for sustainment, how much sustainment has there been in the period since the funding ended. And I think I've run out of time, haven't I?
Yeah. I'm kind of saving a bit of question time.
Yeah, exactly. 5 minutes for questions, sorry. Thank you. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much.